Thank you, Mr. President and members. I am happy to be here tonight to talk about Senate File 1384. 1384 is the Nurse and Patient Safety Act. It replaces the Keeping the Nurses at the Bedside Act that essentially passed away a little earlier this evening. Before I talk about this legislation, I want to say a significant number of thank yous. The work that we have done on this legislation mirrors what we have been doing together all session, making significant, transformative change for the people of Minnesota, and none of us does that by ourselves. And this work, of course, the bill before us, when you see it, is not something new, but instead a skinnied down version of what we have been working on in both bodies all session. So it's a subtraction and not an addition, and the issues in this bill, you will recognize them when I talk about them. But first to the thank yous. I want to thank the people who work with me in the office I hold, Teresa Mosier and Alexis Kesey, who have been tireless, really tireless, in their efforts all session, but particularly on this because they know how important it has been to me and to the people of Minnesota. I want to thank Liam Monahan, who has pitched in admirably, quietly, forcefully to take a room of people, including me, to a place of clarity to put together this piece of legislation. I want to thank Eric Nauman, who has pitched in to make sure that the appropriations that were carried in the Human Services Bill that we passed earlier today under the leadership of Senator Wickland are expressed here as well. I want to thank the revisers who have been working around the clock for all of us, but in addition on this piece of legislation. I can't say enough about Leader Dietzich today. And really around this issue and so many issues, she's been a force. And in this, she has been my partner to make sure that we were able to find a pathway forward for nurses and for patients in their care. And this legislation really is about nurses and direct healthcare workers and the patients in their care. And Leader Dietzich has been a real partner in this, and I'm incredibly grateful. My colleagues on the conference committee, Senator and registered nurse Liz Boldon, and Senator Abeler, former representative, now Senator Abeler, who has been true to his word, a creative partner, a problem solver, and this legislation is stronger because of his input. I want to thank the co-authors on this legislation. I want to thank Senator Wickland for carrying these provisions in the Human Services and the Health and Human Services Conference Report until we pulled them out. And I want to thank everybody in the body. I know that this has been an issue that has grown very contentious for many, many reasons, which I'll talk about. But you've stuck with me, you've supported me, you supported this effort. That's important to me, it's important to the nurses, but most importantly, it's important to Minnesotans who one day will be patients in the care of registered nurses and direct care workers. It's also important to note my brothers and sisters in labor, SEIU Healthcare, AFSCME Council 65, the AFL-CIO, and of course the registered nurses who have been fighting for this for so many years. I want to thank people for their care, especially the nurses, for their fight and for never quitting and never, ever walking away from patients or the people in your care. And it's why we're here tonight, because you insisted and you kept pushing and reminding us that our job here is to solve problems and to build a future for the people of Minnesota. Senate File 1384 is not going to solve in the way that we conceived the nurse staffing crisis that we're experiencing in our hospitals. And I just need to be really honest about that. We came to fight for that. We didn't win that fight. But we won something important for the nurses. Important provisions that were carried in this bill in Kanaba are now in this bill. And that includes loan forgiveness for people who are studying to become registered nurses. And you all know, we all know, there aren't enough nurses. And we need to keep preparing nurses to come in, especially because we know what nurses are experiencing in our hospitals in the practice of nursing means they come into the practice, but they leave too quickly. And it's one of the reasons why we have a shortage of nurses practicing in our hospitals right now. So loan forgiveness to make sure that there are people able to come into the practice is important. And this bill carries child care support for the people who are deciding to move from being nursing assistants to registered nurses or licensed practical nurses. That's important support for them. There is an analytical study that will be conducted by an independent study along with the Department of Health to understand why and how many nurses are leaving the bedside. Nurses have been telling us for a very, very long time that they're leaving the practice of nursing because of the moral injury that they're experiencing because of short staffing. They've shown up with stacks and stacks of concern for safe staffing. They've told us their stories over and over and over again. And I think one of the most painful parts of this debate in the last couple of weeks is that they're not sure we're hearing them, and they're not sure that we believe them. And they aren't giving up. And now in this legislation is not just a voluntary study like we've seen before, but instead a bona fide analytical study so we can together see the information that will help us understand what's happening with our registered nurses in hospitals. And last but not least, and probably the most important provision, is the workplace violence prevention portions of this legislation that have been carried in the Keeping the Nurses at the Bedside Act all the way through. This is nation-leading work. It's powerful because we know, especially since the pandemic, that registered nurses are getting hurt on the job. They're getting beat on the job. That's true for LPNs, that's true for direct care workers, and sometimes it's impacting patients. And so there's an important body of work here to make sure that we're making our hospitals as safe as we can for that practice of nursing. I'm really proud of that. It's important. So this is not where we started. It is not all that we wanted. But those of us who have served for a long time know that you don't always get everything you want in a session or in a debate. And the real trick, and Scott Dibble reminded me of this earlier today, Senator Dibble, my friend, it takes 10 years or 20 years or actually 30 years to finally realize the vision and put it into place. And I'm willing to continue this fight alongside you, knowing that this is not everything, but this is important, and it's valuable, and it's going to help nurses, and it's going to help patients. And I hope tonight to earn your green vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I am not a nurse. I'm many wonderful things, but I am not a nurse. And my question for Senator Boldon is, what is it like to be a nurse at the bedside? What is it like to serve patients in the hospital right now?
Now, Senator Boldon, I know that's a pretty large question, and I want you to connect it to the policy that we are considering tonight. Senator Boldon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Maye Quade, for the question. It is a big question, and we could talk for another 3 hours about that question, but I will not. And I'm looking up into the gallery and seeing other folks who could answer that question as well. So I've been a registered nurse for over 20 years, and some of that time has been at the bedside, and there was a chunk in the middle that was not. And it has been interesting coming back to the bedside after being away for about 10 years, and some things are the same, and some things have changed. And some of those things that have changed are directly related to this bill. It is violence at the bedside. It is patients and family members and an environment where nurses don't feel safe. We are there, we come into this work because we want to take care of people, because we care about people and want to be there to take care of folks, and that is difficult work. There is a weight and a responsibility to that none of us take lightly, and the level of moral injury that comes to that when we are there because we want to do the very best we can to take care of everyone in our care, but you We sometimes cannot do that because of many factors, not having the resources. Staffing is certainly a piece of that for many reasons. It is incredibly difficult in a way that is hard to put into words. And the workplace violence piece of this legislation is important and meaningful and will make a difference in the lives of nurses across this state. Workplace violence is a significant issue in healthcare, not just for nurses, but for aides and providers and lots of folks. And it is something that we are taking action on, and I'm grateful for that in this bill. Another piece in the bill, the loan forgiveness piece, part of being a nurse is oftentimes carrying significant debt. As I talk to my colleagues and nurses, especially new nurses, and many of them are new, right out of college, and carrying that level of student debt is a weight on them as well. And so this will be another piece that will be helpful and meaningful to folks. And so I am grateful for this legislation, and I'll talk later a little bit more about some of those pieces, but there is a heaviness of nurses at the bedside right now. And I also the last thing I'll say is to connect it to something that Senator Murphy said around feeling that nurses are listened to and believed. That is not always the case. And so with this legislation and with here tonight, us having this debate and talking about this is important. And I want the message to be clear to nurses across the state that we hear you. We are listening to you, we hear you, and we believe you. We believe your experience of what you are going through and the difficulty you are facing, and that we are taking steps and taking action to make that better.
Senator Maye Quade.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was wondering if Senator Murphy would yield for a question.
Senator Murphy, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Maye Quade.
Thank you, Mr. President. Earlier tonight, Senator Murphy said that this violence prevention provision in the bill that will be before us is nation leading, and I'm wondering if she can explain why.
Senator Murphy, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Maye Quade. The reason that it is nation leading is because it's comprehensive. And it is focused specifically on the experiences that people are having in hospitals. And we have, from the time that I practiced to now, what nurses are experiencing is so much different. And it's nurses and direct care staff alike in hospitals and other facilities. We hear about it a lot, just like we hear a lot about mental health care. But the reason why, and thank you for the good question, is because it is a comprehensive approach, and we need that.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I don't need questions, but would this be a good time to offer comments on the bill?
Yes.
That may be coming before us soon. Actually, I just signed the report, so it should be pretty soon. So this will just be my thoughts on the bill. Senator, all the people that had a hand in this, I want to commend them all for their diligence and the efforts that they're making. And some people are wondering why we even need this bill. What's the role of the legislature in injecting itself between what some see as a bargaining problem? Mr. President, quite some time ago, there were people who worked for the railroad, and in the 30s and so on, and they would be, tasking away and putting in the railroad ties and shoveling coal and all that. And every so often, tragically, one of those individuals would get stuck beneath the train and their leg might get cut off, which would be horrible. And the railroad said, well, gee, that's too bad. We can't have people work for us with legs that are cut off. You're free to sue us if you want. And out of that, Mr. President, came the workers' comp system. So they decided to relieve the employee of the opportunity to sue the employer over that, but they gave them then consideration of finding ways to help rehab them, and it's become be quite updated and complex. And it was the role of government legislatures at that time to find a way to deal with what was seen as something that was a great problem. And every so often, every year or two, we have a work comp update. But sometimes that system just doesn't work because it's hard to sometimes see the effect of violence on a worker, particularly when they're in a setting with one person and one patient who may be violent. And hardly any of those things actually come out of lifting injuries, like you think of a work injury or like a pan hits them on the head or something. But it has to do with very real assaults and others. And it seems to me, Mr. President, I don't know why the work comp thing doesn't work in this, but it doesn't. I've had opportunities to talk to well over 100 nurses. I haven't kept track. I just know it's a big number, and probably 200 nurses over my time, and as we've had reasons to get together. And it's a very real thing. Mr. President, it is a thing that nurses are getting hurt. And I don't think the employers are disinterested, but I don't know that they know what to do about it. And we've talked about this, I don't know, Senator Murphy, a decade or longer about this problem. And so, you know, the pure answer, Mr. President, many would say, well, we'll let the employer handle it. This is a workplace issue. It's not our business. But, Mr. President, every so often, some things happen where people are getting hurt, and we have to intervene. We intervene in child protection cases because the family can't work it out. Why couldn't they work it out? Why couldn't the neighbors help them? Well, we pass a law. We create a system. Mr. President, it is time for a system like this for us to weigh in on. And I think that this remnant of what was brought before is actually going to make a big difference. And to the rest of the bill that we're not talking about anymore, what's lacking, Mr. President, I believe that I talked to both. I'm not anti-hospital, I'm pro-hospital. I discussed this morning we need to put money into hospitals. And I see myself as friends to both. And I think from that perch, not being a nurse, married to a nurse, and from being interested in the healthcare side for all these years here, I see myself in a position to understand both sides. And healthcare has become very challenging with the economic side and the staffing side and COVID and all. But I think that building a team, building people on a common ground to advance the purpose of the hospital, which is for patient care, I think is really constructive. And as I help to design those committees where the nurses have a real voice, where management has a real voice, that I thought that was productive. In the same way, Mr. President, that the House has a plan, the Senate has a plan, and you make them go to a conference committee and work it out. And sometimes you need the pressure of time to get those put together. Sometimes they get done at the last minute, sometimes they're done early. But, Mr. President, this bill in the form it's at now will make a very constructive difference. And I don't know it's going to go as far as the other bill to draw nurses back into the workforce, but maybe it will because they'll know that they might be safe. Because, Mr. President, there's no nurse I know who plans to go to work and comes home injured. Like an iron worker working 30 stories above the ground might realize he's got she has a dangerous job. I don't think people in a nursing thinking, boy, I could become disabled at the age of 26. You know, that's never on their, they just want to go help people. So I have been pleased to be a part of this for I don't know how many years, but it's a real thing, Mr. President. This is a solution. There's emails from Mayo and the Hospital Association. I think that's who these are from. They're comfortable with this. Yeah, Mayo and the hospitals. And I'm pleased that they're willing to stand up and say that this is a good idea. And I think, Mr. President, building on this good idea, I think there's hope for the future, not to have a combative future relationship with the hospitals and the nurses, but to build a bridge and a collegiality that makes the next step more possible. So I want to thank the hospitals and the Mayo for engaging here. I want to thank the nurses for realizing this is a great opportunity to get a major thing done, nation leading. And so, Mr. President, I urge members, when they get around to it, to vote green. Thank you.
Briefly, I want to extend my thanks to Senator Murphy for her fierce advocacy for this bill and for nurses. As a fellow registered nurse, it has been a privilege and a joy to work on this with her, and also with the nurses who have shared their voices to put to this legislation. And while this bill does not represent all the work that we want to do and need to do to support nurses, it is needed, necessary, and meaningful. So I am grateful to have been on the conference committee for this bill and to be able to work on it and work towards it. And I think it is especially meaningful to me to be able to cap off this legislative session with this work in a session where we have really focused on the rights of workers and safe working environments and not leaving people behind. When I think about paid family and medical leave, when I think about the HHS bill we passed earlier today around including all of our undocumented neighbors into health care, we have been focused on not leaving people behind. And it is meaningful to me that we are ending this session by not leaving nurses behind and passing legislation that will support them in their work. So I would encourage everyone to vote green.
Senator Maye Quade.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'll apologize. I was trying to follow the exact instructions you gave before, which was to ask questions, but I do have comments on the bill. Mr. President, my daughter has been in the hospital more times than I ever imagined a child could be in the hospital in the 1 year that she's been alive. And I talk about being a mom a lot, but I don't talk about her a lot. When she's in the hospital, her stats drop. She doesn't breathe very well. And the people who run into her room when her oxygen drops below 80 are the nurses. The people who hold me when I cry after we hold her down to suction out her nose are the nurses. The first person she reached for, aside from me or my wife in a week, was Nurse Keisha at Children's Hospital. When nurses tell us that they are caring for too many patients to keep them safe, we have to believe them. There is literally nobody else between the patient and the provider. They are the ones, nurses are the ones providing the care. I'm furious that corporate interests, that people who make millions of dollars, like millions of dollars, in some cases 31-to-1 ratio to the nurses, the people who have the profit motivation to have less people in a building somehow got an equal or greater voice in this conversation than the people who provide the care. Infuriating. What other motivation could nurses possibly have than to say we want safe staffing ratios than the care of patients? There's no other motivation. I love nurses. I'm so grateful to them for the work that they have done before the pandemic, certainly through the pandemic, and now, where care has changed. And so, Mr. President, I know that we didn't get everything we wanted in this bill. We will keep fighting. But to be nation leading in violence prevention, I feel good about that. To do student forgiveness, I feel good about that. To have actual nurses in this caucus leading this charge, I feel good about that. So I'm going to keep on the fight with nurses. And I'm going to keep this fire in my belly because I know that should we end up in the hospital again with my beautiful daughter, the people running into her room to make sure that she stays alive are the nurses, which means I will come here every single day and fight for them so they can continue to provide the excellent care to their patients that they do now. Thank you.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, I appreciate the comments, and I think probably every one of us here has a story and an experience about the value and the importance of nurses. If you or your loved one has ever been in the hospital or had any type of surgery, we know how important nurses are, and we know how important their safety is, as well as the safety and well-being of the patients. But I do have a question, and I just am looking at the conference committee report, which we'll be voting on soon here, which was just posted. And my question is this. It's section 12 of the conference committee report, subdivision 31. And I just want to read the underlined language and ask the author, which I believe would be Senator Murphy, to explain what it means. The new language says that by the 93rd legislature, let's see, by the 93rd in legislative enactment by the 93rd legislature, provisions substantially similar to Senate File 2020, similar to 2023 Senate File 1561, the second engrossment, Article 2. So I went to Senate File 1561 of this year, second engrossment, Article 2. And that is the article that has caused such concern, and that does deal with hospital staffing and staffing ratios. I thought that, or hospital staffing, and my understanding was that was not part of what is coming back to us now in this conference committee report. And I would ask the Senator Murphy, our author, if she would yield and explain what that means in the conference committee report, where it says it says that the appropriation in this subdivision is contingent upon legislative enactment of provisions substantially similar to 2023 Senate File 1561, the second engrossment, Article 2. And that is the hospital staffing article. So I would ask Senator Senator Murphy to explain that particular provision, which was the provision that there was disagreement on.
Senator Murphy, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Nelson. As you will likely recall, the costs for what was Keeping Nurses at the Bedside Act were carried in the Health and Human Services Conference Committee that we passed earlier. And as we put this compromise bill together this afternoon, knowing that that bill had passed, as I understand it, on the recommendation of our staff, it was decided that it would be best to hold that appropriation in as it was described, not with the language, because that language no longer exists, but hold that appropriation at the Department of Human Services for perhaps a similarly situated study or review. It is no commitment to the work. It is no reflection of what will come in the future, but instead a reference to where that money was headed to for the purposes of clarity, for the purposes of transparency, and to make sure that there was a container for those funds at the Department of Human Services, et cetera.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Murphy. So that is important to get certainly clarity on that it does not apply here because this section of the bill has not been enacted or is not part of the conference committee. So, and then my second question is, are there funds then that are already allocated to, I thought I might have heard Senator Murphy say that funds are already being allocated for something that is not being enacted. And I would like some clarity on that, please. If Senator Murphy would yield, Mr. President.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Senator Nelson, there is in the Health and Human Services bill that has already moved funding for loan forgiveness, for the administration of loan forgiveness, and for the activities of the workforce study, that analytical study at the Department of Health.
Senator Nelson.
Well, thank you, Senator Murphy. It's still a little bit unclear if those funds have been allocated to the Department of Health for something that is not being covered in the conference committee report that will be coming to our desks soon. I'm just reading it online right now. And so, again, that's a bit confusing if we're setting money aside for something that has not yet been enacted.
Members, we now have the conference committee report. We'd like to move forward on the conference committee report. Senator Murphy, if you'd like to make your motions.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the foregoing recommendations and Conference Committee report on Senate File 1384 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the Conference Committee. And I ask for a roll call.
Member Senator Murphy moved that the foregoing recommendations and Conference Committee report on Senate File 1384 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the Conference Committee. Any questions, any discussion? The Secretary would take the roll. Senator Boldon, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I report that Senator Mann votes aye.
Senator Mann votes aye.
Senator Port votes aye.
Senator Port votes aye.
Senator McEwen votes aye.
Senator McEwen votes aye.
Senator Morrison votes aye.
Senator Morrison votes aye.
And Senator Klein votes aye.
And Senator Klein votes aye.
Mr. President.
Senator Rasmussen, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Duckworth votes no.
Senator Duckworth votes no.
And thank you, Mr. President. Senator Pratt votes aye.
Senator Pratt votes aye. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 39 ayes and 26 noes, the motion prevails. Members, the House needs to really get this bill, so we really need to move forward. Third reading.
Senate File Number 1384, a bill for an act relating to state government, modifying labor policy provisions, etc.
Third reading. Members, we have two folks on the list, but they're really waiting for this bill, and they told me that they want us to move right away, so I'm trying to be as thoughtful as possible. So the other two that's on the list, Mitchell and Westland. Okay. The Secretary would take the roll on final passage of Senate File 1384. Oh, let's go. Sorry. Members, please vote. Senator Boldon, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. I report that Senator Mann votes aye.
Senator Mann votes aye.
Senator Port votes aye.
Senator Port votes aye.
Senator McEwen votes aye.
Senator McEwen votes aye.
Senator Morrison votes aye.
Senator Morrison votes aye.
And Senator Klein votes aye.
And Senator Klein votes aye. Senator Rasmussen, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Duckworth votes no.
Senator Duckworth votes no.
And thank you, Mr. President. Senator Pratt votes aye.
And Senator Pratt votes aye. Members, no matter how this vote goes forward, we ask that you remain quiet in the chambers. We still have some business that we need to do. If you want to celebrate, you have to go outside. One last thing, we did not let Senator Murphy speak because she's already spoke and gave her thank yous in the beginning, and we did not want to hold up any other minute. The Secretary, all senators having voted who decided to vote or who wanted to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 40 ayes and 28 noes, the bill is 25 ayes, 40 ayes and 25 noes. The bill is passed and its title agreed to.